More than ever, it seems like everything in our community is focused on making, painting, and now printing things faster than ever, all while maintaining an impossibly high level of technical quality. I know that some people need to paint quickly because they're racing against the rules being changed for their armies, but for those of us who aren't bound by tournament regulations, we still get this nagging sensation in the back of our minds that we need to work faster or be more productive. For my fellow content creators, we can end up spending twice the amount of time in the edit for a video. And so, of course, we're going to try everything in our power to get to that 8-minute finish line as fast as possible. None of this sounds particularly fun. And shouldn't the hobby be fun? Welcome to Conjured Craft. My name is Taryn. Let's get started. This week, I want to look at some of the terrain of Sedalia. This is a science fantasy setting that I've been writing on and off for 5 years. I've recently started a new home game set in the world, so it feels like a good time to go through the hundreds of images that I've collected that inspire me. Starting with this fungi landscape by Rachel Raven, I love the colors and contrast between the pools and bleached earth, so I'm going to combine these pools with this piece of art by Dogzillalives. She is easily one of the best creature sculptors of our time. Another source I'm borrowing from is the greatest webcomic I've ever read, Kill 6 Billion Demons by the almighty Abaddon. There are these pillar structures with a steep curve at their base, and I really like their shape, so I want to implement them in some of my world's lore. Now, if you have any sci-fi terrain recommendations, especially weird ones, feel free to put them in the comments. But before we can make the fun stuff, I need to do something I've never done for the internet before, and that's make a terrain board. My main goal for this project is to enjoy the process. When it stops feeling fun, I stop working, which means that this method is not the fastest, it is probably not going to be the cheapest, and to be honest, I'm making it up as I go, but we're all learning, and that's what's important. Using some air dry clay, I'm rolling out a very thin layer onto baking paper. The color or brand of the clay doesn't matter, and I'm not concerned about it drying out and cracking because it's the cracks that we're after. Ultimately, this is going to have to sit overnight to dry out completely, so I've made 2 batches to do some A/B testing. Batch number 1 was left to its own devices for 24 hours. Batch number 2 was baked in an oven at 130 degrees Celsius for about 20 minutes. Not to speed up the dry time per se, but more to see how the clay behaved. Now, drying it out in the oven for a bit produced a more brittle sheet of clay that was easier to break into interesting shapes the next morning. The clay that was left to dry on its own still had a fair amount of moisture, which allowed for me to flatten it down and get a really even surface finish. So take your pick, but I think both of these are great options. While waiting for the clay to dry, I've got this massive backing board from a frame that I found in the tip, and I'm going to use that as the base for my terrain board. You can and should use any junk or recycling whenever possible, just be safe about it. But for now, we have a base and the clay is dry. That means we can start breaking it down into pieces. I'm using my hands to make sure I have some larger chunks when gluing these down, but you can break up your clay any way you like. There's a couple of ways to prevent the MDF board from warping since the material is so thin. What I don't recommend you do is using super glue to put down each individual piece. It would probably get the quickest results, but you will gas yourself if you're not wearing a mask and working in a well-ventilated area. Gluing down each piece with a drop of PVA glue will give you the best chance to prevent the board from warping, but that will probably take more time. You can, however, cover the board in glue, throw all your pieces down, and then put something heavy on top to help keep it in place while it dries. If you still end up with any warping after the fact, I find that if you then put a layer of paint or glue or some kind of moisture on the back of the board, it will warp itself back in the other direction, and basically you'll end up with something that's mostly flat. Whatever method you end up choosing, you can break up this process of putting down the individual chips of clay by working on other pieces of terrain, painting up some models, or watching The Grim North, which is an actual play TTRPG show that I'm in. And you can watch it for free here on YouTube. Links below. You've probably noticed by now that there is no grid system on this board. Personally, I don't like grids anymore. There isn't a way of doing it on natural terrain that isn't distracting to my eye, so I'm skipping them altogether. On the side, I've been working on some measuring widgets that I may cover in the future, or I'll just put up on my Patreon. Once the board is covered though, I also sprinkle on some baking soda while the glue is still wet, and selectively add some smaller chunks of the air dry clay, just to break up the pattern and give it more texture. You could use spackle, plaster, whatever your basing material of choice is, just be sure that you give it a second texture pass. The last thing to do is hit it with a chalk spray paint to give everything another layer of grit and to tie in the terrain. I'm doing my best these days to actively think about what materials and junk I've collected before buying and using things I don't need. A little mindset that my friend Ben started called Hobby Neutral. So for my scatter terrain, I did some experimenting with cardboard and kitchen foil, which in my experience are more accessible materials than, say, large sheets of XPS foam. After assembling my test pieces and putting them through strenuous impact tests, I found that the cardboard was very sturdy, but the foil is definitely faster to form into the shape. I'll always say to just use whatever materials you have on hand, because in the next step, I'm going to end up covering it with a mix of glue and baking soda. One suggestion I will make is that the foil pillars already have so much texture that I decided to break them down to look like the ruins of much older structures that have crumbled with the passing of time. I'm also giving each of these pieces their own bases, using the same MDF board from earlier so that they can stand on their own and won't fall over every time someone gets up to get another drink from the fridge. Just like before, I'm going to rinse and repeat using the chalk spray paint. You can find lots of different brands that will mimic stone, pebbles, and even the crackle effect that a lot of people end up paying way too much money for with hobby materials. This one was available from my local dollar shop, and that's basically my budget for these videos. I want a centerpiece that really sells this alien terrain, so I'm cutting out another MDF square and then using kitchen foil and hot glue to make the edges of my little otherworldly pools. When I'm not shouting into the void that is YouTube, I'm also an art teacher and run sculpting classes. So I've got a bunch of leftover polymer clay that I'm going to roll into different shapes and sizes to make the root-like tentacles that are sprouting out from my pools. Once I know the shape for each of them, I remove them from our terrain base and get them baked separately in the oven. While they're cooking, I can use some more of the air-dried clay chips to match up with the main terrain board. Then to cover the foil, you could use Sculptamold, spackle, but I still have air-dry clay and I know it works. The color is different here because I'm used up all my white clay on the main board. But now with our tentacle roots out of the oven, we can push those back into place and clean up the seams where they meet the air-dry clay. The last thing I'm going to do is cover the terracotta clay with some watered down glue, sprinkle a little bit more baking soda on top, and then use a brush to stipple in that texture. To figure out my paint scheme, I tested a bunch of weird stuff. I used the pillar scatter terrain to do this testing, and I asked my patrons what they thought, which helped me narrow down the final idea. I'm starting off by undercoating the terrain with different shades of purple, mixing in more red and blue on a whim. With the undercoat done, I paint over the large chips with some more white paint because I want the terrain to be an almost red Martian landscape with yellow highlights on top. And since I know yellow is really difficult to paint, I wanted to start with the brightest possible base. This process gets repeated exactly the same on the pools, but for the battle board, because of how massive it was, I decided to just let the purples spill onto the air-dry clay chips. This ended up looking like a by Pride art project, but I really enjoyed the process of making a mess, and I just decided to roll with it. While I'm going to be using this board as my generic outdoor setting for my home game, the pillars and pools, as I've been calling them, are actually plants in my world. Baraga is a tree that grows in the rainforests of Gadaji. Being a massive biome full of hundreds of creatures and thousands of plants, competition for resources can be cutthroat. So the Baraga tree has evolved over time to first grow a powerful root system which creates these pockets or pools that water gets trapped in, helping the trees grow tall in the future. While the Baraga tree does not yield fruit or flowers, as they mature, their wood is comparable to stone, even steel. So when the great city of Dagon was constructed, hundreds of years ago, the trees were all nearly cut to extinction. Some wardens of the jungle started a new tradition of being a steward of their own tree, and over time passed that responsibility down to another member of the family. That practice has evolved and changed over the years, but now almost every family in Dagon has their own ancestral tree, a literal family tree, preserving their heritage, their roots, and their place in the world. Thank you for joining me on this mindful crafting project, especially those of you who watched the video all the way through. I know that life gets busy and it's really fun to watch things that are short and sweet, so I really do appreciate your support. If you would like to see final photography of this project or financially support me in my endeavors, everything I do now lives on Patreon, so feel free to come and join the coven and say hi. If you have any questions, please let me know down in the comments and I will get back to you as soon as I can. Until next time, I'll see you soon.